Hello and welcome wherever you are watching in the world. I'm Edward Löjdquist. I'm a senior non-resident fellow at the Centre for European Policy Analysis, and we're here to discuss the effect of Russia's war in Ukraine on the Nordic-Baltic region. And I can't imagine two better people to have on the panel to help us investigate this, my old friend Fredrik Löjdquist, a former Swedish diplomat of great expertise, who is now at the Centre for East European, the Stockholm Centre for East European Studies, which is an independent institute financed by the Swedish government. Fredrik's had jobs in Georgia. I met him in Moscow. He originally studied at the London School of Economics. And we've also got Hanna Shelest, who joins us from Odessa. Hanna is a non-resident senior fellow with the Transatlantic Defence and Security Policy at SIPA. She's also the Director of Security Programs at the Foreign Policy Council Ukrainian Prism, many other things. But she's best known, I think, for having the zinger of all zingers at the last Lennart Meri conference, when she was recounting how an Italian journalist had said to her that Ukraine, the Russians have to get something for there to be peace. To which she said, yes, how about Lake Como? And I think that just summed up both the shortcomings of the Western approach to the war in Ukraine and also Ukraine's ability to seize the narrative and drive home a point. So Hanna, great to see you, and let's hope we don't have any air raid sirens during the course of this talk, because it's well worth remembering that we may be sitting in the safety of the West, but the Ukrainians are exposed to cut-offs of their electricity, their water, and indeed much worse than that. So Fredrik, I want to come to you first, because you are from a country which has to some extent had a massive geopolitical timeout since 1991. Sweden took the Cold War very seriously, although also very quietly. But after 1991, perhaps more than almost any other country, you took a really big peace dividend. You basically gave up on territorial defense and dismantled the very effective resilience programs that you'd had. And we'll get into more detail on this, but I'd like you to start off just with a sort of 3 to 4 minutes on how the Russia's war in Ukraine has impacted on Swedish public opinion and on Swedish decision making.
Well, thank you, Edward, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I mean, first of all, I always want just to remind everyone that Russia's war against Ukraine started in 2014. It was, a major escalation from February this year, but the actual war started in 2014. And you're right, is that the Swedish defense policy was on a strategic timeout before that, and the alarm bells should have gone off louder after Russia's war against Georgia in 2008. It didn't really. But there was a defense commission and a new defense bill in 2015 where focus was then back to territorial defense and also growing international defense cooperation, not least with Finland, but also with other countries in Northern Europe, with the UK and with the US. Now, you could say that the biggest strategic change in Swedish defense and security policy took place this spring. As a direct consequence of what happened after 24th of February, and that was that Sweden together with Finland decided to join NATO. This is more than 2 centuries of policy of non-military non-alliances or neutrality, which was changed, and this was a direct consequence of Russia's actions. And I would say that there is a process of rebuilding the Swedish total defense efforts, which started then after 2015. There was a new defense bill in 2020, where there's even stronger focus on this, and also where there's a special chapter on hybrid threats. And there are various efforts taking place right now. The 1st of January this year, we had a new government agency on psychological defense, something we had before, but that was dropped after the end of the Cold War. And we have a new government just in place 7 weeks now. and they have, for the first time in Swedish history, appointed a national security advisor. So I think the awareness of the problem of the Russia crisis, of the threat, is there. And there is ongoing efforts to rebuild not only the military territorial defense, but also the total defense, and including efforts to counter various forms of hybrid threats. But there is still much to do.
Indeed, there's a great deal to do, and I worry a little bit that the outside world tends to take headlines about political support for necessary initiatives as being a sign that those necessary initiatives are actually going to happen and going to be executed fully and very competently. And although the Swedish state is, of course, extremely effective and does get things done, there may be a bit of a gap between perception and reality when it comes to recovering the ground lost over the last 30 years. We might want to get into that into discussion. But I want to come to you next, Hannah. I made a few remarks at the beginning about the electricity and water, and of course that's a reminder that this isn't just the kind of hybrid warfare we talked about pre-2014 that you're facing. This is everything from full-scale use of high explosive steel against human beings and their buildings, through to the cyber and the information warfare and all the other stuff that normally comes in the hybrid warfare bucket. So what I'd like you to do is to tell us, what do we know now after 10 months of the intensified Russian onslaught since February that we didn't know from the previous period of 2014 up to February 22? What are the looking at it analytically? What are the takeaways about Russia's means of warfare?
Thank you, Edward. There are definitely several things that we need to pay attention. First of all, it was quite a strange understanding of what has been hybrid. And for the last 9 years, predominantly when we spoke about hybrid, most of the experts and especially media preferred to speak about everything except of military. But de facto, why it is hybrid? Because it was always military and non-military components. And without the threat of military usage, we would call it just covert operations or information warfare or economic warfare or anything else what we used to have for centuries before this. So only because we always had this military component, that was really important. That's why it was hybrid. And the last 9 months, 10 months, has clearly demonstrated that sometimes it is very thin line between these non-military and military. First of all, because how Russian Federation is using their military. When you made your plans, you planned about the military against military, army against army, air defense against the air attacks. But de facto, what Russia is doing, especially the last months, they're targeting all civilian objects. They are targeting critical infrastructure that de facto are against the humanitarian law, because you cannot target these. That is the war crimes. Russia said, who cares? We think that they're military objects. That's how they are targeting electrical grid. That's how they are occupying the nuclear power plants. And that is one of the very important elements that in the modern type of warfare, even that sometimes you feel that you return back to the Second World War type of the warfare, still there are a lot of new elements. And these new elements, not only in terms of using drones or electronic warfare, but also in defining the targets and trying to influence the government through the population. Because that's the second issue that the last months have demonstrated, how important is unity between the nation or population, society, and the armed forces. Because when you speak about resistance and resilience, you cannot speak just about the state. You're speaking about the whole society, where the armed forces and population are equal partners and just the atoms of the one big molecule. And that is extremely important because of several issues. And let's be honest that in the latest NATO documents, we started to see the first tips of understanding of this. First of all, plenty of our communications, both in terms of transportation, supply, communications, they are not divided between military and civilians. They are very much interconnected. They depend on each other. When you speak about the supply to the armed forces, how ready is your government or the governmental institutions, let's say, immediately to prepare the increased number of the soldiers if their direct attack happens? Without volunteers, without the business involvement, sometimes that's almost impossible. So these ideas of or cyber attacks, it's not just the government who can act in case you have a massive cyber attack, and cyber stopped to be just a civilian or business domain. It started to be the fifth domain of current warfare. So again, without the civilian experts in the cybersecurity, it would be impossible to debunk a lot of those attacks that Ukraine faced. And issues like digitalization, because sometimes you need the additional efforts to help the government to fulfill the services, to deal with the humanitarian issues that you have on the ground, because the war is both, it is the humanitarian and military components. That's why it seems to me that that is extremely important issue about the resilience as the societal, as the joint understanding of what should be done, and the hybrid both warfare and response, because how the country is responding is also in quite a hybrid manner. When you can imagine in any European countries that the civilians, I mean, just the population will donate to buy a satellite for the armed forces. That's what Ukrainian population did a month ago. Now, not only drones, yeah, but also the satellites, or the charity foundation to receive the only license in the world to buy directly combat weapons for the armed forces of your country. So that is these new unique elements that are coming that demonstrate this connection between the society and the military that are extremely important. That it is not only how your society supporting your armed forces at the small issues. I mean, when you are coming to the village and you feel that your local population is in support of you, that's something traditional that the armies always had for centuries. But that level of support, that level of involvement, that's something unique that definitely this situation brought. And the last but not the least, that is probably the constant dispute between the total defense and resilience. What is more important, what is more effective? Even that we understand that Swedish, for example, total defense is more of the reverence to the Second World War concept of total war against total defense. I mean, coming, yep, originally. But for us here, how we discuss in Ukraine, the total defense is still a reactive approach, while the resilience is different approach, because it is the acceptance that you cannot be prepared to any threat. But how you build your institutions, your protocols, your society in such a manner that you can quicker overcome any type of the risk, challenge, threat that you have. And that's probably quite a philosophical question for what really the countries should be prepared. And is the Ukrainian example is a sample of success and something to be lessons learned after these 10 months, and to try to evaluate what from two approach is more effective, or let's say how to unite those approaches.
Well, thanks so much for that, Hannah. And I want to come to Fredrik in a moment and just ask him to reflect a bit on this kind of, you know, what this makes us, how this makes us think about our doctrine in terms of total defense and resilience and so on. But I just want to follow up on what you said first, which is, I think that you're obviously the war has played a very important role in consolidating Ukrainian society and making it far less fragmented than it was. It's closed the gap between state and society, which was also quite big. But there's one other element which I think is also really interesting, that it's kind of blurred the distinction between the public sector and the private sector, that we see now that business is part of civil society in a way that perhaps we didn't before, and businesses are acting as moral and patriotic agents. They are doing whatever they can, you know, with the profit motive coming second or nowhere. And it's a sort of different way of thinking about business, seeing them donating money, trying to, you know, fix the infrastructure and so on. And I just wondered if you'd like to expand a little bit that on what that means in practice. What are you seeing in your daily life in Odessa that would have been impossible in sort of pre-February or in pre-February or pre-2014 conditions?
It is more about pre-2014, because many of the elements that allowed Ukraine to be successful in 2024 is because we already had some of the networks and some of the actions since 2014. It's been just a period of some years when both business and society decided that, okay, now government can do it by their own, so we slow down a little bit. But let's say the networks and mechanisms being built back in 2014 for many of these issues. You saw it even during the Revolution of Dignity. So not only the military actions, how business became involved. But if you speak about the last 10 months, you are absolutely right. We started to see the social responsibility of business from the absolutely different concept. If previously very often social responsibility concept for business was the donation somewhere, or gender campaigns, some disability people campaigns, human rights campaigns that they've been involved. So now we started to see how they prioritize differently their actions. Especially, you can see it at the newly liberated territories, how business are coming, how they're cheering. It's not just donating money to the certain actions that we can do it. We are supporting some actions. That is physical, immediate coming of their workers. That is attempts of the business to be resilient and comfortable for the people on the ground when they can deliver both humanitarian aid, but services as quickly as possible, because they understand how important they are for people. How sometimes, recently it was a wonderful article about one of the Ukrainian mobile operators, how their engineers worked till the last moment in Mariupol, up to end of April, if I'm not mistaken. They hidden by themselves several very important equipment, and it was the last tower for the connection of the Ukrainian mobile operator in the city that allowed to deliver information, to stay connected. And how to name it? It is the civil responsibility, or is it business responsibility? That's probably both. So the business, even the big corporations, started to think more responsible, more society-oriented actions from the small villages to the big decision. Because this big decision is also, for example, to see how the companies been evacuating the personnel from the front line or from the occupied territories, how they've been trying to relocate, how they've been trying to the small companies to continue working. Or different types is when the restaurants, understanding that they're losing, like there is nobody in March or April in the restaurant, but they started to think what we can do the best. We can feed people whom we need to feed now. We have huge amount of territorial defense forces. They still don't have their structure. So let us feed these people who are defending us, because we understand as soon as the war is over, then our profit is coming. We can return to the life as usually. So these social responsibility concept really evolved and changed during the 10 months, and the business started to think not about classical profit, but about the business development as the part of the society resilience.
Right, thank you so much. That was exactly what I was hoping you would say, and extremely interesting. Fredrik, I should have said before when I was introducing you, were actually, of course, not only Swedish ambassador in various places, but Swedish ambassador for hybrid threats at one point. So you are, to some extent, Mr. Hybrid, or actually ambassadors aren't Mr. So you're Excellency Hybrid for Sweden. So talk us through a bit how the Swedish understanding of hybrid warfare has developed, and any thoughts you have on Anna's idea about the distinction between old style total defense and new style resilience.
Well, I think, I mean, maybe starting with the total defense. I mean, the total defense concept was developed in Sweden during the Cold War. And that means that total defense means just that defense is the sum of military defense and civilian defense. And civilian defense means that government agencies, authorities, and companies have a task to fulfill in case of heightened alert or war. And there is a peacetime planning for that. And that means that the total defense is basically only triggered when the government or the parliament makes a decision that we are in a heightened alert. Then there is a certain set of legislation and rules that kicks in, but all of this has been, prepared beforehand in peacetime. And in Sweden, one basic principle of this is that it's a also principle of responsibility. That means that whatever a government agency, a municipality, or region are doing in peacetime, they should continue to do this also in wartime or in crisis, which has a certain resilience itself, because everyone knows what to do, and you don't have to wait for central orders or planning. And all these preparations, which also includes training, planning, and during the Cold War, storage facilities and things like that, of course, in itself constitutes a form of resilience. Now, a lot of this was dismantled then after the end of the Cold War, and is now being rebuilt in Sweden in a sort of 2.0 new version. And I think the COVID crisis showed us, the increased vulnerabilities in terms of, the whole just-in-time capitalist economy. There are no storages for anything, and our healthcare system was not really prepared for this, and so forth. And here, that was an interesting difference to Finland, because Finland had kept its storage facilities and things like that. When it comes to hybrid, when I was working to this, and you're right, Edward, I was Sweden's first ambassador for countering hybrid threats between 2018 and 21, and working for the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs and representing Sweden in the sort of international discussion and cooperation on these things. And my main takeaway from that and my experience is that to deal with hybrid threats, you need to do three things, or maybe four things. The first one is that you have to have a situational awareness what's actually going on, which is a very tricky one, because hybrid threats are by definition elusive. They are there to create confusion, deniability. It's difficult to connect the dots, and we need to gather information from sectors. Traditional intelligence and security services is no longer enough, because hybrid threats can sort of appear in basically any sector of society or policy. And we have to become much better to connect the dots and understand what's going on. The second part is building resilience. Or deterrence by denial, that we are, decrease the vulnerabilities. And the third one, which is perhaps the most difficult one, is they have to develop a toolbox to counter these things. There must be a cost imposition for this kind of aggressive, antagonistic behavior. There is a long tradition in Sweden of thinking. The traditional terminology was not hybrid threats, it was sort of gray zone activities. But gray zone was mostly seen as a zone which you pass through from peace to war. This was the stage before war, so to say. And that was somewhat misleading, because hybrid activities can, of course, be a preparation for military action and war, but they don't have to. And sometimes the whole point by hybrid campaigns is that you are under the threshold for war or armed aggression. So I think there had to be some conceptual rethinking on the Swedish side, and that's why I was so happy that in the Total Defense Bill 2020, the term was then hybrid threats was then officially introduced in the Swedish political terminology. And there are these efforts. The challenge with that in a system of Swedish and this principle of responsibility is that it sometimes makes it difficult to have a whole of government and a whole of society approach to this. That you need to have everyone needs to talk to everyone, and that's why I'm also happy to see now that the new government has appointed this national security advisor. Will be a national security council. And also with a secretariat which is being set up right now. So I think there are a lot of things that are being addressed, and I think, and the fourth factor is maybe surrounding all of this, creating the context, is that you have to have a common strategic culture. You have to have a common understanding of the threat, what's going on, and I think that has definitely developed, and I think that's one of the advantages of Sweden, because I think at least since 2014 there is no political party in Sweden or no major political force that questions the nature of the problem, and that's Russia's aggressive behavior. And there is broad political and parliamentary consensus of that. And I think you find this in the Nordic countries, you find it in the Baltic states, you find it in Poland and Czech Republic. But there are many other European countries where there isn't this sort of joint strategic understanding of the nature of the threat. So you don't only have to develop this common strategic culture inside the country, but across also in the international cooperation. Which is, I think we're getting there, but it has been a long trip, and we all use different concepts. We have different national traditions and countries. I think resilience is extremely important, and I think there are very interesting and very impressive lessons learned from Ukraine and the resilience that was there. As Hannah said, I mean, the basic sort of cultural, there were mechanisms that were in place, but also how Ukraine has been able to develop this since February 24th this year. But resilience, this is what we do to ourselves. Situational awareness is what do we know about the enemy, the antagonistic actor, and the countering, the response is what we do to them. Sometimes I find that the discussion tends to focus only on resilience, and to say that resilience fixes everything, but and that's sometimes a fig leaf, because people don't want to talk about the response, the actual imposition of cost that we actually have to do, and that you also have to discuss hybrid threats in terms of deterrence, and that has made some European politicians and others sort of uneasy. But that's not to belittle the importance of resilience, and I think we all, I mean, if any Western country or current EU country, how will we deal with the situations that Ukraine is now dealing with on a daily basis? Electricity outages, no water, the whole infrastructure being on constant stretch from war and so forth. So there's much for us to ponder upon. And unfortunately, I mean, this is the Ukrainian people now who has to draw all these lessons, but we must learn from this.
There's a big question which I want to get onto later on in our discussion about how the sort of cross-society, cross-government efforts that one needs to counter hybrid threats are compatible with the rule of law, separation of powers, and the different sort of rules and processes that make a democratic society what it is. We don't want to be in a society where everything is seen through a counterintelligence lens, where everything is militarized, everything is, national security is the only thing that matters, although that may be what we have to do in extreme cases. And there's a real danger, I think, that as we try and respond to the Putinist threat, we end up by sort of self-Putinizing our societies. But I want to park that for a moment and come back to you, Hannah, because Fredrik said a very interesting thing about threat perception. And one of the things that really struck me in the run-up to February was that I was getting, like many people, very clear briefings from different governments about Putin's war plans and how war is really looming. His essay in the summer was tremendously significant. The troop deployments are tremendously significant. It could happen any moment. And even days before the invasion, I was getting these briefings, and I and other analysts were quite skeptical, not least because the Ukrainians were skeptical. And we had colleagues going to Ukraine saying, "So Russia's about to attack you," and President Zelensky and the others saying, "Stop scaremongering." And there was a real tension in Ukrainian decision-making circles about, do we tell our public prepare for war and risk a panic, or indeed probably prompt a panic, or do we say keep calm and carry on? and the result is we're not prepared properly. And I think if you look back at February and think what could we have done differently, clearly there was a huge amount that could have been done in terms of stockpiling weapons, better communications and so on, that would have boosted Ukrainian resilience and made it much harder for the Russians to advance, particularly in the sort of Zaporizhia southern region, going north of Crimea, where they met very little resistance. So can you reflect on that for a bit? What's the trade-off between threat awareness and publicizing threat awareness and preparedness, and then not demoralizing the public population, spreading panic on the other?
You know, it is not only this. I would probably divide to the several levels your question. First of all, the general perception of the threats. And it always depends on the very important issue, our past experience. And that is extremely important, because when you speak about the threat perception among our partners, even that the US provided them with the information, but I talked with a few ambassadors to NATO, for example, and they said, you know, for us, it was difficult to believe in the fact that Americans presented, because we had a trauma of 2003 and Iraq. 15 years passed, yeah, almost 20 years passed since that invasion, but still it is this distrust among even allies regarding the information about the threats that are presented. The second problem is definitely the different perception of threats, the level of the dangerous or the priority of these threats. Because when you speak with the Spanish about the Russian attack a year ago, they said, come on, it is so far from us. Let's look here, the Northern Africa, that is much more important. That is the biggest threat happening here. You speak with another state, they said, look what is happening in Syria or Iran. That is immediate threat that we have. Why we should think about the potential threat from the Russian Federation. Maybe they attack, maybe they will not attack. The same when you come to Ukraine, it was difficult for many to believe. And at that time, even we, the experts, were giving only 30% of probability for the Russian attack, because we couldn't imagine that Russia would go to such actions. Because logically, we thought that they could gain much more by political pressure, by threatening us rather than acting. So as soon as they are just threatening us, maybe somebody will push us for neutral status or for some other concessions. But as soon as they attack, everybody would understand that they are aggressor. It is nothing to negotiate about. So this threat perception based on the previous experience is extremely important for our understanding of the future actions. And it's difficult to say what lessons can be learned from this, because we always based on our biased perception of any type of the information that we are receiving. However, if you put the second part of your question, could Ukraine be prepared better? It seems to me that it's not only about the threat perception, because some actions you couldn't do. If you would say the population that, okay, on the 24th, Russia would attack, I'm not sure that people would start preparing, but people definitely would start panicking. And it's not about the population, it's more about how the governmental institutions were ready or not, because now we already know from a lot of the public records that, for example, some types of the weapons should be delivered to the armed forces, or that some decisions about the air defense was done not because of the preparation, but because of the individual decision of the general who said, okay, that will not harm. Let's move us from the bases and just move around the city. It's better we present it as a training rather than being attacked. But it was not because they really believed and knew that Russia would attack that day. It was more about, okay, let's better do it. Can you be prepared to this? Could you be better prepared? Yes, it seems to me that at least the top military leadership should have all of this information to be a little bit better prepared if they received all necessary information, either from our partners. But at the same time, and that is the third part of the question, it seems to me that we have individual perceptions and we have collective perceptions. It's difficult to ask why Ukraine didn't believe if so many partners around us was not believing as well. So, you know, even if you started to have the seed of doubts inside of your heart, okay, we knew that one day Russia definitely would attack. Probably not that it would be the same big attack and massive attack, but that some disruptions at the border should happen, or some attempts to capture Kakhovka, Kherson should happen. But when France, Germany, all other partners were saying, no, we still under the control, we are still calling to Mr. Putin, he's not so crazy. You're overestimating the threats. Don't worry, you just need to sit and to negotiate with him. Definitely, it's normal that you would like to probably calm down yourself as well and say, yeah, maybe I'm panicking. Probably they can have Mr. Putin under the control. So this collective against individual is a huge question that honestly I don't have answer. Could it be done differently? And as we say in Ukrainian, history doesn't like conditional sentences, meaning what if? Unfortunately, we are in the situation we are now, and we should learn the lessons. But at the same time, we never will be able to say what if we believe or we trusted this information more.
Yeah, and it's not a video game either, where you can just spool back and play it again, pressing different buttons. So, Fredrik, I want to push you now on the question of how one sort of hardens society without destroying it, because Sweden is perhaps one of the most painstakingly law-abiding countries in Europe, with very strict rules on what the intelligence services can and can't do, great attention to data, data privacy, scrupulous lines between public and private, and so on. To what extent is that antithetical to the sort of preparations you need to protect yourself against hybrid threats?
Well, I mean, coming back also to what the question you raised earlier. I mean, we have to remember that a country like Russia uses hybrid threats basically with one or two purposes. The one is to influence our opinion or this democratic decision-making process in one way or another to Russia's advantage, or it's just to create confusion, disrupting, undermining societal trust, institutions, and so forth. And these threats are a threat to the very way our societies work, our democratic political system, free, open, democratic societies, and the way our free market economies work, and so forth. And that's the values, and that's what we have to protect, exactly these things. And we should not and cannot fall into the trap to start to employ the same kind of methods that Russia is doing, or China, or else other, because that would undermine our own societies, but it will also open that what the Russians exactly want, this whataboutism. Look, we are engaging in exactly the same game, and there are no rules for this game, and you are doing exactly the same to us. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Well, if Sweden is more law-abiding than other countries, I will let others judge that. But of course, there are, constitutional and legal restraints on many things. And I don't think they need necessarily to be antithetical to sort of harden your actions or resilience. And there are also things that are now being reviewed in Sweden. I mean, various forms of legislation. There's a government bill right now on foreign espionage. Espionage in Sweden used to be defined only if something was threatening the national security of Sweden, which meant that basically you could be a Swedish person or a person acting in Sweden, selling secrets about international cooperation or other organizations, which was not narrowly defined as the national security of Sweden, and you could get away with it because there was no legislation in place to get to that. That's now being changed, and there are a number of other legislations being changed. So it's more a question of actually sort of culture and organization mentality, how you work with things, who is talking to whom, how do you organize these things, and you can do this, I think, quite well without sort of necessarily compromising, rule of law and things of that. An important thing is, awareness that there are many government agencies and also, private companies that are today highly relevant for security policy and foreign policy that traditionally have not perceived themselves to be so. And they may see things or observe things, and they didn't really think, that it didn't matter, or this was nothing to report about it, or it wasn't about this mandate. So it's about the sort of awareness. This autumn, only in the recent weeks and months, we have Swedish media has been reporting about two quite major spy cases. The one is our two brothers who have been working for the Swedish security police and military intelligence, if you're to believe what's in the media, who has now been accused for espionage. And there was a Russian couple that moved to Sweden earlier that was arrested recently under fairly sort of dramatic circumstances with helicopters and special police and other things involved in that. So I think that there is a growing awareness and concern, and people see the threats. What makes me a little bit worried sometimes is, for instance, when you discuss disinformation. Which is tricky, and I really think you need really know. To me, hybrid threats is when there is an antagonistic intent behind it, and there is a foreign state that ultimately is behind it. The actors that are doing it don't have to be state actors or anything. They may not even know that they're working for a state actor, but there has to be a sort of foreign state antagonistic intent behind this, and then we have to do something about it. But we have freedom of speech, we have free media, and people must be allowed, even crazy people and people who have opinions we don't like, must be allowed to express these opinions. If it's done in a systematically way with a foreign intent behind it, then we have to do something about it. And sometimes I'm not saying this is the case in Sweden, but I just noticed that in the general discussions, and sometimes politicians internationally are very keen of starting to manage social media, who can say what, when, and where. And all these discussions always make me a little bit uneasy, because these are exactly the things that we need to defend. I'm not saying that there are any easy solutions. And we are in a learning process, and of course social media has changed a lot of the whole information landscape and so forth. But I think we have to be of course we have to do a lot of things, because the security landscape is a tough one out there, and we have to be vigilant and aware, and we have to do things. But at the same time, let's not get carried away, and we have to stick to our own principles. That sounds like a very general statement, so I don't know if I answered your question, Edward. But
let me just ask Hannah, what's the state of free speech in Ukraine in current conditions?
Theoretically, it is the total free speech that makes the life easier, but then it is a question how you measure it. Because, for example, if you have the limitation that currently Ukraine has regarding the TV, when we have so-called single marathon, when different TV channels should show the same. There are several TV channels showing there, so it's not one governmental channel. There are several independent private channels that united together with the government, but few others are out of this marathon. Is it the limitation of the free speech? No, because they're still allowed to be at the satellite online and provide their activities. Nobody is closing them. But at the same time, because they limit their possibility for air in normal due to the single marathon, some of the media organization can say that that is violation of these rules. Also, definitely, you have this certain work of the security services of Ukraine if you have statements regarding Russia or undermining the government. But that's the question. Is it about national security or the free speech? Because if you were saying something positive about the aggressor, about the state that you are in war, that's not about free speech. So that's why when we speak about the free speech, that's always a very thin line. And at least what I think Ukraine has positive, we have quite a strong civil society element in all of these as a check and balance, because we have the journalist ethic committee. We have a special name, but for the purposes when the journalists themselves can evaluate each of the cases, was it violation or not. You have the special counsel that make the investigations. You have security services. So there are different elements involved. It's not that one person in the government can say, no, you're losing your license, you cannot speak like this, or just because you put a post in the social networks, you immediately will be arrested. Definitely not. But at the same time, if you're posting constantly something in support of the Russian forces, or undermining or bringing the hate speech, you can expect that the security services can come and check who are you. And very often, unfortunately, when security services or police were entering the premises of such people, they found either Russian propaganda materials or their communication with the Russian curators who said to them what to do. So in times of war, we understand that the level of awareness or the high alert of the security services is always higher than in the peaceful times. But it is up to the civil society and for the parliament to keep control, so this awareness would not bring the edge.
Fredrik, if you cast your eyes across the Baltic Sea to Latvia, today's big story has been the banning of TV Dojd, the exiled Russian quasi-liberal TV station, which was had its license withdrawn for having broadcast a brief segment in which one of the presenters, now sacked, appeared to suggest that he was collecting money on behalf of the Russian armed forces. And today the station turned up to an appeal hearing, but thought this could be conducted in Russian. Didn't bring anyone with them who spoke Latvian, so the hearing's been postponed. It's not over yet. But looking at it from Stockholm, when you look at Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, both in terms of their restriction on Russian broadcasting and in their hybrid warfare preparations generally, what conclusions do you draw?
Oh, I mean, that's a difficult one, and I think, I mean, in general, I'm not speaking for myself, but I think in general, the Swedish instincts has been that one should be very, very careful about sort of closing down media or not allowing it. I think that has partly changed over the last 9 months, and that there's a greater understanding for you know, RT and you know, various Russian propaganda outlets, which are not sort of normal media or anything like that. Sweden has been involved for quite some time, also supporting various media outlets and also making sure that there are alternatives to the sort of the official or Russian propaganda media. I'm not really, you know, willing to comment on a special case in Latvia, the Dojd, and of course the vulnerability, the situation of the Baltic states is a totally different one from the one in Sweden. But I think the lesson learned is that we have to be vigilant. We have to understand who's who and who's doing what, but also to make sure that there are sound good media outlets who also are Russian speaking. I think this is something that we in the West need to invest in, also to support those who broadcast into via YouTube or whatever it is into Russia, because we need to provide alternative free media outlets in Russian, and also to be vigilant for of course Russian propaganda or propaganda outlets. But it's very difficult from the outside to really have a strong opinion on this.
Mm-hmm. And if you just look at what the Baltic states have been doing over the last 30 years in terms of their what we now call resilience, it seems to me there are several things that the outside world can learn from. One is the use of reserve forces. So Estonia has the defense fleet, the kite fleet, and also a cyber kite fleet specifically for bringing people from outside the world of defense into a reserve capacity to deal with the cyber threat. The Lithuanians have the Riflemen's Union, which is also a very broad footprint, semi-autonomous force that has all sorts of reserve and counter-hybrid capabilities. I just wonder if there's anything in the Baltic that either you or, for that matter, Hannah, when you're looking at it, is there anything you think, gosh, we should have done that while we had the chance before the war intensified, or indeed before 2014? But Fredrik, if you could import one bit from the Baltic states into Sweden, what would it be?
I mean, one bit that would be the sort of the strong sort of civil society engagement, and you know how everyone is working in the same spirit. And I think that's because I have better knowledge. It's a very strong case in Lithuania, and how there are different sort of you know, on social media, the famous elves and so forth. But there's a strong, broad engagement, and there are also people, technologically apt people who are developing you know, nifty apps and various tricks and things like that. And I think we have something to learn there. And you know, a sort of resilience entrepreneurship that involves private business and civil society.
And Hannah, when you look at the Baltics, I think you were there virtually at Maigre in April. I don't know if you've visited the Baltic states before, but is either from what you've experienced there, from what you've read, is there anything particular in the Baltic region, or indeed anywhere else, that you think would have been is a particular applicability for Ukraine?
You know, Ukraine before 2022 started the experience of creating different types of the territorial defense. We studied the Swiss example very carefully. We studied the Baltics example very carefully. At that time, it was predominantly cybersecurity groups that had been created in Estonia that really became very interesting for Ukraine, when you have just a very small unit for cyber. But at the same time, you have a big group of those who are ready, let's say, in half an hour to join the team in case of the big DDoS attack or any other type of the cyber attacks. That's what they experienced, and that's what Ukraine didn't discuss at that time. But at the same time, just in January this year, Ukraine created its own territorial defense forces after several years of studying the best experiences. And we had just 1 month for really studying, assembling them. When the February came, just started training these people. And it seems to me that as a result, we created a very unique system of the 3 levels of territorial defense. First of all, because of the size of the country, and that's something incomparable between the Baltics and Ukraine, definitely, we let's say planned to have 25 brigades, so 1 for each of the regions of Ukraine, who would be in charge for the certain tasks at their own territories in times of crisis. These people are well prepared, but they are not serving in the armed forces. They're called in case of crisis to help with patrolling, securing, or some other tasks. So the armed forces can be with their main task at the battlefield, and just with a small core team who will be constantly in charge, the military under the command of the army. But the war changed a lot. On the one hand, it demonstrated the importance of these territorial defense forces, because in many villages on the north, when the Russians were coming, we didn't have that much of the armed forces. So the territorial defense were really fighting there on the border. These people better knew the environment, the terrain, all their villages, roads, forests around, so they could be more agile and more effective on the ground while waiting for the main forces to come. And because of that experience that they received at the very first days, several months in war, Ukraine changed the legislation and allowed the territorial defense to be fully involved in the military activities, and also to move them in case of necessity beyond the borders to which they belong. So Odessa territorial defense can fight in Kherson region, for example. But that is definitely something unique that is still in the development, in the certain process of understanding the value, and even in the certain, let's say, the necessity to evaluate not only their role, but also should it be any limitations, because we understand that professional military sometimes are very cautious about all these territorial defenses suddenly having more responsibilities because they consider that they are less prepared. And this necessity of the bigger forces against their better preparation, that's the question that the governments always will have. So Ukrainian case, because we had only 1 month for the real preparation from the legislation adaptation to the actual warfare, is something to study, but at the same time as exception from the rules. Probably not all elements of these can be learned by other countries. But what we learned, that's definitely you always need to have the reserve, and you can have territorial defense, or you can name them in any other way, for the particular tasks. So that's exactly what I said in the beginning, for the for example, for the cyber attacks or for some other task, when you understand exactly the narrow task and the capabilities that you may need.
I think Edward froze here.
Considering that we have the last 5 minutes, we can make the conclusions with you by ourselves in these case. Fredrik, my question will be for you. What is the balance between or among, in this case, territorial defense or resilience? If you make the new plan for Sweden, what will be there? What is the priority?
No, I think territorial. I mean, first of all, I mean, we were in a phase since 2015 rebuilding territorial defense in Sweden. What happened this year is, of course, now with our application for NATO, that we will have to plan for a future where we will be part of NATO defense planning, and that the Swedish military will not be only involved in defending Sweden, but also, you know, maybe larger parts of Europe. And how this will play out will be interesting. And I don't think it's necessarily an either or. But that means our prospective NATO membership and the rebuilding of the military capabilities means that the whole concept of deterrence is coming back into the Swedish sort of security policy thinking and culture, and partly in new waves. And in parallel to that, there are all these things that are there to strengthen not only our civilian defense but great parts of resilience. And I can notice this. I myself and my colleagues, we are addressing, you know, the Swedish Central Bank, bankers unions, private companies, various government agencies. We are making presentations basically every day because there's such a huge demand out there to try to understand the new security landscape in Europe and in Northern Europe and the Baltic Sea region and Russia's actions. So there's a lot of things going on simultaneously. But of course, the single biggest change factor is of course the preparations for the NATO membership.
Thanks so much for jumping in there, Fredrik. I'm sorry, this was the Wi-Fi here in London went down briefly, so I was unable to take the discussion on between you and Hannah. But I think we're almost we're in our final couple of minutes, and I think the thing that I want to thank SIPA for hosting this, and you both making the time. And I think that the thing that comes, that's the biggest point that has jumped out at me from this, is that you don't need to be a very strong, well-functioning state to do hybrid resilience. Some of the best-run countries in Europe are really rubbish at this and are now scrambling to catch up, if at all. And I think that, for example, you know, if we were looking at Germany, we'd see plenty of room for improvement on that front. And countries that have had a great deal of difficulty re-establishing their statehood in difficult conditions, having had appalling corrupt leaders like Yanukovych and all sorts of political upheavals, and then, you know, the ongoing war since 2014, have still managed to conduct a really impressive hybrid response. So being rich and well run is no defense, and being much poorer and less well run is no excuse. and I think we have a huge amount to learn from the Ukrainians. I'm so grateful that Hannah was able to be on this call. We yearn for the day when we will see you atom to atom rather than just electron to electron. And Fredrik, thanks so much for everything you've done while you're in government and for the opportunities you're now able to exploit out of government to get the message across. So I'm going to say goodbye from shaky Wi-Fi London. Thank you very much to everyone who tuned in. Don't forget to follow SIPA on Twitter. You can follow Fredrik on Twitter. You can follow Hannah on social media as well. And we have many more events like this coming up, and we will be delighted if you will tune in. So thanks so much indeed. Silent applause.
Thank you, Edward and Sipa and Hannah.